In the early 1800s, in a northern state where slavery had been abolished, a black girl was born. Let's call her Sarah. The year was documented. Her birth was recorded in the family Bible. Her name was written in the parish registry. And most importantly, she was born free. Her parents had escaped bondage years before, traveling north through networks of safe houses and sympathetic guides. They'd arrived in a city where black families could own property, attend church work for wages, and raise their children without the constant fear of separation. It wasn't paradise. Prejudice existed everywhere. But it was different. It was a place where the law, at least on paper, recognized their humanity. Sarah's father worked as a laborer, loading and unloading cargo at the docks. Her mother took in laundry, spending long days over steaming tubs, washing and ironing the clothes of wealthier families. The work was hard. The pay was modest, but it was theirs. De chose italiano. They could leave if they wanted. They received wages for their labor. These simple facts, the ability to negotiate, to own one's own time, to keep the fruits of one's labor. These were the markers of freedom that most Americans took for granted, but which Sarah's parents had fought desperately to obtain. Sarah grew up in a small house on a street where several other free black families lived. She knew the names of all her neighbors. She played with her children. She learned to read from a woman down the street who had taught herself and now ran informal lessons for the neighborhood children. Reading was important. Her parents insisted on it because in a world where your freedom could be questioned at any moment, documentation mattered. The ability to read a contract, to understand a legal notice, to verify what papers said about you, these skills could mean the difference between freedom and bondage. She helped her mother with the laundry work, learning to sort fabrics, to test water temperature, to apply just the right amount of pressure with the iron. She ran errands, carrying bundles of clean laundry back to customers. Always polite, always careful. Her mother had taught her to be watchful, to notice who was around her, to avoid certain streets at certain times, to never speak to strangers who asked too many questions about where she lived or who her family was. Because even in a free state, Dangerous, there were men who made their living kidnapping free black people, forging papers that claimed they were escaped slaves, and selling them to southern plantations. It happened more often than most people knew or cared to acknowledge. Newspapers occasionally reported such cases, but they were usually brief notices, quickly forgotten. A girl disappeared. A young man vanished. Families searched, but the trail went cold. Sarah's parents tried to protect her without frightening her too much. They wanted her to enjoy the freedom she'd been born into, but they also needed her to understand its fragility. Freedom, they told her, wasn't something you could take for granted. It was something you had to guard every single day. She attended church on Sundays, sitting between her parents in the wooden pew, listening to sermons about deliverance and the promised land. The church was the center of their community, a place where marriages were celebrated, where births were recorded, where the dead were mourned, and where news spread about opportunities and dangers alike. The pastor kept careful records, birth certificates, baptismal records, marriage licenses. These documents were precious. They were proof of identity, proof of family, proof of free birth. Sarah's freedom wasn't just a legal status. It was her lived reality. She walked down streets without asking permission. She ate meals with her family at their own table. She slept in the same bed every night, in the same house, surrounded by people who loved her. These simple, ordinary facts of daily life, the kind most children never think twice about, were the substance of her freedom. But in 1824, when Sarah was 12 years old, everything changed. In one afternoon, the life she'd known, the freedom she'd been born into, the future she'd imagined, all of it was ripped away. By nightfall, Sarah's parents were frantic. They went to the authorities. They filed a report. The officer who took their information was polite, but not particularly concerned. Girls ran away sometimes, he suggested. Perhaps she'd had an argument with her parents and would return when she cooled down. Sarah's father insisted that wasn't possible. His daughter wouldn't run away. She'd been taken, kidnapped. The officer's expression shifted when he heard that word. Kidnapping was a serious crime, but proving it was difficult. There were no witnesses. No one had seen anyone grab the girl. For all the officer knew, she really had run away. He promised to make inquiries, but his tone suggested he didn't expect to find anything. What Sarah's parents didn't know, what they couldn't know yet, was that Sarah hadn't run away. She'd been grabbed off the street by two men who'd been watching the neighborhood for days, looking for opportunities. Professional kidnappers who knew exactly what they were doing. They'd grabbed her quickly, efficiently, one hand over her mouth to prevent screaming. Strong arms, lifting her off her feet, into the wagon within seconds. The bundle of laundry dropped and forgotten on the street. Within minutes, they were out of the neighborhood. We didn't know they were miles from town. Sarah fought. She tried to scream through the hand clamped over her mouth. She kicked and twisted. But the men were strong and experienced. They'd done this before. They knew how to control a struggling child. They tied her hands. They gagged her. They covered her with a tarp in the back of the wagon, hiding her from view. The kidnappers moved with practiced efficiency. They knew which roads to take, which towns to avoid, where they could stop safely. They had forged documents, ready papers, that identified Sarah as a runaway slave named Lucy, property of a plantation owner in Virginia, apprehended in a northern state and being returned to a rightful owner. The papers looked official. They had stamps and signatures. No one who glanced at them would question their authenticity. The men traveled mostly at night, sleeping during the day in barns or wooded areas off the main roads. They fed Sarah just enough to keep her alive. They told her that screaming would do no good, that no one would believe her, even if she did cry out, that she was property now, and she'd better get used to it. Sarah didn't believe them. She knew who she was. She knew she'd been born free. She knew her parents would be looking for her. She knew that somewhere there were documents that proved her identity. She clung to this knowledge even as the wagon carried her farther and farther from everything she knew. Within a week, Sarah crossed into a slave state. The landscape changed. Suddenly there were plantations, sprawling fields of tobacco and cotton, large houses set back from the road, and clusters of small cabins where enslaved people lived. This was a different world, a world where slavery was legal, where the sight of a black person in chains raised no questions. The kidnappers sold Sarah to a slave trader in a small town just across the border. The transaction was quick and businesslike. Money changed hands. Papers were transferred. The trader looked Sarah over like livestock, checking her teeth, examining her hands, assessing her value. Within 2 weeks of the afternoon she'd left home to collect laundry, Sarah stood on an auction block. Potential buyers circled around her. They asked her age. They asked about her health. They discussed her likely value as a field hand, as a house servant, as future breeding stock. She was 12 years old. The auctioneer called for bids. Numbers were shouted. The price rose. Finally, a plantation owner from the deep south made the winning bid. The gavel fell. Sarah's childhood ended in that moment. The life she'd known, the freedom she'd been born into, the future she'd imagined. All of it was gone, stolen by men who saw her not as a human being, not as a child, but as merchandise, as profit. She was put in chains and loaded onto another wagon, this time heading even farther south, farther from home, farther from any hope of rescue. But Sarah didn't know then what she would learn over the coming years. Her parents hadn't given up. They would never give up, and the battle for her freedom was only beginning. The plantation where Sarah was taken was a vast operation. Hundreds of acres of cotton fields stretching as far as she could see. The main house sat on a hill, white-columned and imposing, surrounded by gardens and outbuildings. Below, arranged in rows, were the slave quarters, small wooden cabins with dirt floors and gaps in the walls where winter wind would whistle through. Sarah was assigned to field work. She was given a different name, Lucy, the name on the forged papers that claimed she'd been born enslaved. She was told to forget her old name, forget her old life, forget where she'd come from. She was property now. The sooner she accepted that, the easier things would be. But Sarah couldn't forget. Wouldn't forget. The work was brutal. She woke before dawn, when it was still dark, roused by the overseer's bell. There was a brief period to eat a meager breakfast, usually cornmeal mush or stale bread, and then out to the fields. During planting season, she walked the rows, dropping seeds into holes covering them with dirt, moving to the next row. During growing season, she chopped weeds, hour after hour, under the burning sun. During harvest, she picked cotton until her fingers bled, filling sack after sack, her back aching from the constant bending and lifting. The overseer watched constantly, riding his horse along the edges of the fields, looking for anyone who slowed down, anyone who stopped to rest. Punishment was swift and brutal. The whip was used frequently. Sarah learned quickly that complaint brought more pain. Defiance brought worse. The only way to survive was to work, to keep your head down, to endure. At night, exhausted, she returned to the cabin she shared with other enslaved women. They gave her food when they could spare it. They taught her how to move efficiently in the fields, how to avoid the overseer's attention, how to treat blisters and injuries with the limited remedies available. They showed her small kindnesses that made survival possible. But they also warned her, don't talk about freedom. Don't talk about the North. Don't talk about family you left behind. Such talk was dangerous. It could get you sold away. It could get you punished. It could give the master reason to think you were a runaway risk, and then the chains would come out, and the work would become even harder. But Sarah was different. She'd tasted freedom. She'd lived it for 12 years. She knew what it felt like to wake up in the morning and choose what to wear, where to go, what to do with her day. She knew what it felt like to sit at a table with her family, to laugh at jokes, to make plans for the future. She knew what it felt like to learn to read, to improve at a skill, to earn praise for work well done. That knowledge was both her torture and her strength. It was torture because she knew exactly what had been stolen from her. Every day of enslavement was a fresh violation, a continuing theft of the life that should have been hers. But it was also strength because it meant she never fully accepted her captivity. She complied because she had to. She worked because the alternative was death. But in her mind, in her heart, she remained free. She never stopped believing that somehow, somewhere, her parents were looking for her. She never stopped hoping that rescue would come. She never stopped knowing that what was happening to her was wrong. Not just unfortunate, not just unlucky. Wrong, illegal, unjust. In the quiet moments, the brief rest periods during the hottest part of the day, the evenings after work when she had a few minutes before exhaustion claimed her, she would whisper to herself, reciting her real name, reciting the name of the street where she'd lived, reciting every detail she could remember of her free life, committing it all to memory so that if when the moment came to prove who she was, she would be ready. She didn't know it then, but far to the north, her parents were doing the same thing, preserving every detail, gathering every document, building a case, refusing to give up, refusing to let their daughter be forgotten. The system had stolen Sarah. But her parents were about to show that system that some things, some people were worth fighting for, no matter how long it took. Sarah's parents never stopped searching for their daughter, Sarah, from the moment she vanished, making it their life's mission. They frantically searched every street, posted notices, and even hired an expensive private investigator who specialized in tracking kidnapped free black people. Despite finding leads about other missing children and suspicious wagons, Sarah remained elusive, having been moved quickly across state lines into a slave state where the trail went cold. Sarah's father eventually traveled south himself, visiting border towns, markets, and auctions, hoping to recognize his daughter among the enslaved. He faced suspicion and indifference from traders who profited from the illegal trade of free people. Devastated but refusing to give up, he and his wife began systematically gathering legal documentation, including birth certificates, baptismal records, and neighbor testimonies, to prove their family's free status and legal standing. As years passed, the family's savings were depleted, forcing them to take on extra work while connecting with abolitionist organizations and other searching families. They placed persistent newspaper notices and attended meetings to learn about Southern plantation conditions, all while their community rallied around them with prayers and financial support. The church kept Sarah's name in their weekly prayers for over 5 years, maintaining hope that justice would eventually prevail. Finally, a traveling preacher brought news of an enslaved woman named Lucy on a Deep South plantation who whispered that her real name was Sarah and she was born free. Overjoyed to know she was alive and still fighting, Sarah's father prepared to travel south with his carefully built case and thorough documentation. He believed the law was on his side. unaware of how little it would matter in a system designed to protect the institution of slavery above all else. Sarah's father made the journey south with hope burning in his chest despite the warnings he'd received. Abolitionist lawyers had counseled him. They'd explained that Southern courts were hostile territory, that judges were often slaveholders themselves, that the entire legal system existed to protect property rights, and enslaved people were legally classified as property. But he had evidence. Undeniable, documented evidence. Surely that would matter. He located the plantation where Sarah was held. He sent word to the owner that he was there to retrieve his daughter, who'd been kidnapped and was being held illegally. He presented copies of her birth certificate and baptismal records. The plantation owner refused to meet with him. Instead, he sent his overseer with a message. The girl called Lucy was legal property, purchased through legitimate channels, and no northern papers would change that fact. If Sarah's father continued to make trouble, he'd be run off the property or worse. So Sarah's father did the only thing he could. He filed a lawsuit in the local court, petitioning for his daughter's freedom based on a free birth. He hired a local lawyer, one of the few willing to take such a case, and prepared to prove his daughter's identity. The plantation owner hired a powerful law firm, lawyers who'd successfully defended slave owner interests in dozens of cases, lawyers who knew exactly how to manipulate the system. The trial began on a humid morning in late spring. The courtroom was packed. Cases like this were rare enough to draw attention. White spectators filled most of the seats, curious to see how the proceeding would unfold. A few black people were allowed in the back rows. Sarah was brought to the courtroom in chains. Her father saw her for the first time in over 5 years. She'd grown. She was 17 now, no longer the child who'd left home to deliver laundry. Her face was thinner. Her hands were roughened by years of field work. But her eyes met his across the courtroom, and in them he saw recognition, hope, and desperate longing. The trial should have been straightforward. Sarah's father presented her birth certificate, officially notarized and dated. The document clearly showed that a girl named Sarah had been born free in a northern state in 1812. He presented the baptismal record from their parish, showing the same date, to some name, the same parents' names. He presented testimony from neighbors who'd known Sarah as a child, people who'd made the journey south, specifically, to testify. They described Sarah's appearance, her personality, her life in their neighborhood. They swore under oath that the girl in chains was the same Sarah they'd known. He presented documentation of the kidnapping report filed with local authorities the day Sarah disappeared. He presented records showing his own and his wife's free status, their employment history, their standing in the community. The evidence was overwhelming, clear, documented, notarized, testified to under oath. But the plantation owner's lawyers came prepared with a different strategy. They didn't try to disprove the documents directly. Instead, they attacked everything around them. First, they argued that the papers were likely forgeries, that free black families were known to manufacture false claims in attempts to steal valuable property, that birth certificates and baptismal records could be easily faked, that even notarization couldn't be trusted when northern authorities were sympathetic to abolitionist causes. The judge allowed this argument without requiring any proof that the documents were forged. The mere suggestion was enough to cast doubt. Next, the lawyers attacked the witnesses. They questioned whether these people could really remember a child they'd known years ago. They suggested the witnesses had been paid or coerced. They pointed out minor inconsistencies in their testimonies. One remembered Sarah's favorite color differently than another. One described her hair slightly differently, and used these tiny discrepancies to suggest the entire testimony was fabricated. Then they produced their own witnesses, men who swore they'd known the girl called Lucy since she was born on the plantation, men who described her mother, supposedly an enslaved woman who died years earlier, men who provided detailed stories about Lucy's childhood on the plantation. None of it was true. Sarah's father knew it was lies. Sarah knew it was lies. But the witnesses testified confidently, and the plantation owner's lawyers presented their testimony as equally valid as the documentation Sarah's father had brought. The lawyers argued that Sarah's father couldn't even prove that the girl in the courtroom was the same Sarah mentioned in his documents. Yes, the paper showed a girl named Sarah had been born free, but how could he prove this particular person was that girl? People looked alike. Memories were unreliable. And the girl had been called Lucy for 5 years now. She'd answered to that name. She'd worked on the plantation. She'd lived as enslaved. Why should anyone believe she was someone else? Sarah was not allowed to testify on her own behalf. The law didn't permit enslaved people to testify against white people. Her voice, her memory, her own account of her kidnapping, none of it could be entered into evidence. The trial lasted 3 days. The judge listened to arguments from both sides. He reviewed documents, he heard testimony, and then he ruled. The judge declared that Sarah's father had failed to prove his case, that while the documents showed a girl named Sarah had been born free, there was insufficient evidence to prove that this particular girl was that Sarah, that the testimony of the plantation owner's witnesses was equally credible as the testimony of Sarah's father's witnesses, that the court had to respect property rights, that the girl called Lucy had been purchased legitimately, and without absolute proof that she was someone else. The plantation owner's claim was stronger. Sarah remained property. The gavel fell. The case was closed. Sarah was led out of the courtroom in chains, her eyes locked on her father's face, tears streaming down both their cheeks. Her freedom existed on paper in a northern state. Birth certificates and baptismal records and witness testimonies all proved she'd been born free. But in this courtroom, in Tees, moment her skin color mattered more than any document ever could. The system had stolen Sarah twice, once on a street in a northern city, and once in a southern courtroom where evidence, truth, and law itself were twisted to protect the institution of slavery. Sarah's father left the courthouse, devastated but not defeated. If the courts wouldn't recognize his daughter's freedom, he would find another way. He would keep fighting, and he would make sure the world knew what had happened in that courtroom. Sarah's case wasn't an exception. It wasn't an unfortunate anomaly in an otherwise just system. It was a system working exactly as it was designed to work. Throughout the antebellum South, the entire legal structure existed for one purpose: to protect slavery. Every law, every court procedure, every judicial precedent was crafted to ensure that enslaved people remained enslaved, and that the property rights of slave owners remained absolute. Judges in southern states were overwhelmingly slave owners themselves. They had direct financial interests in maintaining the system. Their wealth, their social status, their political power, all of it depended on slavery continuing unchallenged. Juries, when they were used at all in such cases, were composed entirely of white men, most of whom either owned enslaved people themselves or aspired to. They had no incentive to rule in favor of a black person claiming freedom. In fact, ruling for freedom threatened their own interests. If courts started freeing people based on claims of free birth, it would open the floodgates. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of enslaved people might come forward with similar claims. So the courts developed strategies to prevent this. They set impossibly high standards of proof for freedom claims. They allowed enslavers to present fraudulent testimony without penalty. They disallowed the testimony of black people, even those claiming free status. They accepted the legal fiction that purchase documents for enslaved people were more reliable than birth certificates showing free birth. There was even a concept called practical slavery that operated in Southern courts. The idea was that regardless of legal status, if a black person had been living as enslaved, working on a plantation, answering to an enslaved name, being treated as property, then they were functionally enslaved, and that condition should be legally recognized regardless of what documents said about their birth. This meant that the longer someone was held in slavery, the harder it became to prove they'd ever been free. The very passage of time worked against freedom claims. Sarah's 5 years in bondage became evidence that she belonged there. Thousands of free black people were kidnapped and enslaved under this system. The numbers are difficult to estimate because so few cases were ever documented. Most families didn't have the resources Sarah's family had. Most couldn't afford lawyers or travel costs. Most couldn't gather the kind of documentation Sarah's parents had assembled. And even those who could, like Sarah's father, found that documentation meant nothing when the courts were designed to ignore it. The kidnapping networks operated with near impunity. Professional kidnappers worked openly in northern cities. They watched neighborhoods. They identified targets, usually children or young adults, who could be easily overpowered. They used violence and speed to grab their victims and transport them across state lines before families could respond. Once victims crossed into slave states, recovery became nearly impossible. Even if families could locate their relatives, even if they could afford to pursue legal action, the courts were stacked against them. Slave traders knew this. They accepted kidnapped free people right alongside legally enslaved people escaping northward who were being returned. Some traders specialized in kidnapped free people because the profit margins were higher. TAPD. Kidnappers a fraction of what the victims would sell for, knowing that the legal system would protect their property rights once the sale was complete. The federal government offered no help. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 had created a legal framework that prioritized the return of escaped enslaved people over the protection of free black people from kidnapping. The act allowed slave catchers to operate in free states and required local authorities to assist in capturing and returning supposed runaways. This meant kidnappers could claim their victims were escapees. They could produce forged documents showing ownership, and local authorities in free states were legally obligated to help, not hinder, the kidnapping. Free black people in northern states tried to protect themselves. They carried freedom papers at all times, documents proving their free birth or manumission. But these papers offered limited protection. They could be stolen or destroyed. They could be dismissed as forgeries. And if someone was grabbed off the street and transported quickly, having papers in their possession meant nothing if no one bothered to look at them. Communities established mutual aid societies and vigilance committees. When someone was kidnapped, the community mobilized to try to track them down before they could be moved south. But the kidnappers were organized and fast. By the time families realized someone was missing and organized a response, the victim was often already across state lines. Abolitionist organizations documented these cases. They published accounts in newspapers. They presented testimonies to state legislatures and Congress. They tried to create public awareness that kidnapping free black people was a widespread, systematic practice. But most white Americans didn't want to hear it. In the North, there was some sympathy for anti-slavery causes. But even there, racism ran deep. Many people simply didn't care what happened to black families. In the South, kidnapping was either denied or justified as necessary to prevent enslaved people from escaping to freedom and then claiming they'd always been free. Sarah's father returned north from the trial and immediately began sharing this story. He spoke at abolitionist meetings. He provided testimony to committees investigating the kidnapping trade. He showed the documents he'd assembled: birth certificates, baptismal records, witness testimonies, and explained how the court had simply dismissed all of it. His case became evidence. Proof that the system was designed not to seek truth or administer justice, but to protect property claims, even when those claims were built on lies and violence. Abolitionist publications printed accounts of Sarah's case. It appeared in newspapers and pamphlets. It was presented as an example of how slavery corrupted every institution it touched, including the courts themselves. But none of this brought Sarah home. The case that was supposed to prove her freedom had instead confirmed her enslavement. The judge's ruling meant she was legally property now, and any further attempts to claim her freedom would be even harder. Sarah's father returned home, devastated but not defeated. He'd done everything right. He'd followed every legal pathway available. He'd presented irrefutable evidence, and it had meant nothing. But Sarah's story wasn't over. Because while the legal system had failed, other forces were beginning to shift. The abolitionist movement was growing stronger. Political tensions over slavery were intensifying, and Sarah herself, still trapped on that plantation, still held the truth of her identity in her heart. The system had ruled against her, but history wasn't finished with her case yet. After the trial, Sarah was returned to the plantation in chains. The brief hope she'd felt when her father arrived was crushed by the weight of the judge's ruling. She'd sat in that courtroom and watched evidence of her freedom be dismissed. She'd heard lies about her birth presented as truth. She'd been powerless to speak in her own defense. The overseer made sure she understood that any further attempts to claim freedom would be punished severely. She'd embarrassed the master by forcing him to go to court. She'd cost him money for lawyers. There would be consequences. For weeks after the trial, Sarah worked under closer supervision. The overseer watched her constantly, waiting for any excuse to use the whip. Other enslaved people on the plantation gave her sympathetic looks, but kept their distance. Association with someone who'd claimed freedom was dangerous. But Sarah survived. She'd survived the kidnapping. She'd survived 5 years of brutal labor. She would survive this, too. The trial had changed her, though. Before, she'd held on to hope that rescue would come. that the system would recognize the truth, that her freedom would be restored through legal means. Now she knew better. She'd seen firsthand how the system operated, how evidence could be ignored, how truth could be buried under lies, how law itself could be twisted to protect injustice. She didn't stop knowing she was free. That knowledge was bone-deep, unshakable, but she stopped expecting the system to acknowledge it. If freedom was ever to come, it would have to come through other means. Years passed. Sarah watched the rhythms of plantation life continue unchanged. Seasons of planting and harvest, births and deaths among the enslaved population, sales that tore families apart, punishments that broke bodies and sometimes spirits. She watched other enslaved people and saw the different ways they coped with bondage. Some seemed to accept it, to make what peace they could with their condition. They built relationships, formed families, found small joys where they could. Others maintained a burning resentment, a constant anger that sometimes exploded in small acts of resistance, working slowly, breaking tools, feigning illness. Sarah fell somewhere in between. She complied with orders because the alternative was violence. She worked because refusal meant death. But in her mind, she never submitted. She never accepted. She remained in her own understanding. A free person held captive, enslaved in body, but never in spirit. She heard news, occasionally, from the wider world. Enslaved people who were hired out to neighboring plantations brought back snippets of information. Runaways who were captured sometimes had stories about what they'd seen on their brief journeys. And sometimes, carefully, quietly, people would share whispered reports about political developments, about the growing tensions between North and South over slavery. Sarah learned that abolitionist movements were growing, that newspapers in the North were publishing more critical accounts of slavery, that some northern states were passing personal liberty laws designed to protect free black people from kidnapping, though enforcement remained weak. She learned that her case had been documented, that abolitionist publications had written about her trial, that her father's testimony about the court's dismissal of evidence had been presented to legislative committees. This knowledge gave her a strange kind of hope. Not hope for immediate rescue, she'd learned that was unlikely, but hope that her suffering meant something, that her case was contributing to a larger understanding of how deeply slavery corrupted American society. As more years passed, Sarah entered her 20s. The brutal work had aged her body prematurely. Her hands were permanently calloused. Her back carried the marks of whippings. Her health was compromised by years of inadequate food and medical neglect. But she'd also grown stronger in ways that weren't physical. She'd learned to read people, to understand power dynamics, to navigate the dangerous social world of the plantation. She'd learned which overseers were particularly brutal and which might occasionally show mercy. She'd learned how to appear compliant while maintaining her inner sense of self. The country was changing too, though slowly. The political situation was becoming increasingly unstable. Debates about slavery dominated national politics. New territories were being admitted to the Union, and each admission sparked fierce arguments about whether slavery would be permitted there. Then came the 1850s, and with them the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which made the kidnapping problem even worse. The new law required citizens to assist in capturing suspected runaways and imposed penalties on anyone who helped enslaved people escape. It created federal commissioners who could order the return of supposed runaways based on minimal evidence. It denied accused runaways the right to testify on their own behalf. For free black people in the North, the new law was terrifying. Now, kidnappers had even more legal protection for their crimes. Now anyone could be accused of being a runaway, and the burden of proof was on them to prove their freedom. Sarah, still held on the plantation, heard about this development from whispered conversations. The news was devastating. It meant the legal situation had gotten even worse. It meant that even if she somehow escaped and made it back north, she could be recaptured and returned based on the plantation owner's claim that she was his property. But in the late 1850s, something began to shift. Sarah started hearing different kinds of whispers. Talk about a growing movement to end slavery entirely. Talk about political parties forming specifically to oppose slavery's expansion. Talk about the possibility, still distant, still uncertain, that slavery itself might not last forever. Sarah was in her 30s now. She'd spent more of her life enslaved than free, but she still remembered. she still knew who she was, and she still held on to a kernel of hope that somehow, someday, the truth would matter. Her father, back in the North, had never stopped fighting. He'd spent years working with abolitionist organizations, sharing Sarah's story, using their case as evidence of the systematic kidnapping trade and the court's complicity in it. He'd aged significantly. The stress of losing Sarah, the devastating failure of the trial, the years of continued advocacy, all of it had taken a toll. But he refused to give up. He attended every abolitionist meeting he could. He contributed what money he could to organizations working to end slavery. He kept Sarah's freedom papers updated and safe, holding on to them like sacred objects. In 1861, the political situation that had been brewing for decades finally exploded. Southern states began seceding from the Union. War came. News of the war reached the plantations slowly, through whispers and rumors. The white population was agitated, fearful. Some of the younger white men left to join the Confederate Army. The plantation's operations continued, but the atmosphere had changed. For enslaved people, the war brought both hope and danger. Hope that Union victory might bring freedom. Danger because plantation owners, fearful of rebellion, increased surveillance and punishment. Sarah continued to work, to survive, to wait. The war years were brutal. Food became scarce. Resources were diverted to the Confederate war effort. Enslaved people received even less than they had before. Disease spread through the slave quarters, killing the weak and the elderly. But Sarah survived. After everything she'd endured, after more than a decade and a half in bondage, she survived. And then, finally, in 1863, came news that changed everything. President Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Enslaved people in Confederate states were declared free. The news reached the plantation through various channels. Some enslaved people heard it from Union soldiers as the war moved through the region. Others heard whispers from white people's conversations. At first, many didn't believe it. Freedom proclaimed from far away didn't mean much if the plantation owners still held the whip. But gradually, as Union forces advanced and the Confederacy weakened, the reality set in. The old order was collapsing. The system that had held Sarah in bondage for 17 years was falling apart. When Union troops finally reached their area, Sarah was among the first to approach them. She told them her story. Not all of it. There wasn't time, but enough. She told them she'd been born free. She told them she'd been kidnapped. She told them she'd spent 17 years in illegal bondage. The soldiers documented her case. There were thousands of such cases. Tay told it. The war was revealing the full scope of how many free black people had been kidnapped and enslaved. Sarah was officially freed. Given papers documenting her free status, told she could go wherever she wanted. After 17 years of captivity, Sarah was free again. Legally. Actually. Finally. But freedom came with overwhelming challenges. She had no money. No resources, no idea how to navigate the world as a free person in the middle of a war zone. And the emotional scars ran deep, deeper than any physical wound. She made her way north slowly, traveling with other freed people, working odd jobs to earn money for food and shelter. It took months to make the journey. When she finally reached the city where she'd been born, where she'd lived the first 12 years of her life, she barely recognized it, and it barely recognized her. Her mother had died years earlier. Her father had told her when they were finally reunited. The stress and grief of losing Sarah had broken her health. She'd worked herself to exhaustion trying to raise money for the search, and her body had simply given out. Her father was elderly now, frail, but alive. When Sarah appeared at his door, he wept. They held each other for a long time, neither speaking, both trying to bridge the 17-year gap that separated them. Sarah was free, but the cost of that freedom, the years stolen, the mother she'd never see again, the life that should have been hers, the costs would never be repaid. Sarah's case became one of the most chilling and well-documented examples of how freedom on paper meant nothing when the system itself was designed to ignore it. In the years following the Civil War, as the nation struggled with Reconstruction and the question of how to integrate millions of formerly enslaved people into American society, cases like Sarah's were examined carefully. Historians, lawyers, and activists documented the systematic kidnapping trade that had operated for decades. Sarah's story was cited in abolitionist literature that was now being read more widely. It appeared in congressional testimony as legislators debated what protections should be afforded to Black Americans. It was presented in court cases as evidence of how thoroughly the antebellum legal system had been corrupted by slavery. Her case proved something that many white Americans had refused to believe: that a free Black person could be kidnapped in broad daylight, transported across state lines, sold into slavery, taken to court with ironclad documentary evidence of their freedom, and still be legally declared property. The birth certificate meant nothing. The baptismal records meant nothing. The witness testimony meant nothing. The documentation of the kidnapping meant nothing, because the system wasn't designed to protect Black people. It was designed to protect property claims, and slavery had reduced Black people to property. Sarah's trial transcript, preserved in court records, became a teaching document. Legal scholars studied it to understand how courts had manipulated evidence and procedure to reach predetermined conclusions, how standards of proof had been applied asymmetrically, impossibly high for freedom claims, absurdly low for property claims, how the legal system had functioned not as a neutral arbiter of truth, but as an enforcement mechanism for racial oppression. Abolitionist organizations used Sarah's case in their campaigns for civil rights legislation during Reconstruction. They argued that laws protecting Black Americans' rights needed to be comprehensive and federally enforced, because local courts couldn't be trusted. Sarah's trial was Exhibit A in demonstrating that proposition. Her case also illustrated the crucial role of documentation. Sarah's parents had done everything right. They'd kept meticulous records. They'd gathered witness testimony. They'd maintained every piece of paper that could prove their daughter's identity and free birth. And it still hadn't been enough to overcome a judge's determination to rule in favor of slavery. This realization led to important developments in how freedom was documented and protected. During Reconstruction, there were efforts to create federal systems for documenting citizenship and free status. Birth registration became more standardized. The 14th Amendment established birthright citizenship specifically to prevent the kind of status ambiguity that had allowed people like Sarah to be enslaved despite free birth. Sarah herself lived quietly in the years after her return north. She married a man who'd also been born free, but had spent years enslaved after being kidnapped. They understood each other's trauma in ways few others could. They built a modest life together, always aware of how fragile security was, always watchful. She spoke publicly about her experiences occasionally, particularly to audiences interested in understanding the realities of the kidnapping trade. She was careful about what she shared. Some memories were too painful to revisit, some experiences too humiliating to recount. But she believed her story needed to be told. In her testimony, she emphasized certain points repeatedly: that she'd never forgotten who she was, that 17 years of being called by a different name, of being treated as property, of being forced to comply with enslavement, had never changed her fundamental understanding of her own identity. She'd been born free. She'd known freedom, and nothing, not chains, not whips, not court rulings, had ever truly taken that knowledge from her. She also emphasized the role her parents had played, their refusal to give up searching, their meticulous documentation, their willingness to spend every resource they had in pursuit of her freedom. She wanted people to understand that she'd survived not just through her own strength, but because she'd known, even in the darkest moments, that someone was fighting for her. Sarah's father lived long enough to see the 14th Amendment ratified in 1868, establishing that all persons born in the United States were citizens with rights that states couldn't abridge. He died believing that the legal framework that had failed his daughter would never be allowed to operate again, that future Sarahs would be protected by federal law. History would prove his optimism premature. The promise of Reconstruction would be betrayed. Jim Crow laws would create new systems of racial oppression. The legal system would continue to fail Black Americans in countless ways. But Sarah's case remained in the historical record, a testament, a warning, a reminder. Her story was preserved in archives and libraries, in court records and congressional testimony, in abolitionist publications and historical accounts. Researchers studying the antebellum period, the kidnapping trade, the corruption of the legal system, the lived experience of free Black people in America. All of them eventually encountered Sarah's case. In the 20th century, as the civil rights movement fought against new forms of racial oppression, Sarah's case was revisited. It appeared in histories of American slavery. It was taught in law schools as an example of how legal systems can be perverted to serve injustice. It was cited in arguments for why federal protection of civil rights was necessary, why local courts couldn't be trusted, why documentation and evidence alone were insufficient without a commitment to justice. Sarah's case reminded us that justice isn't automatic, that laws on paper mean nothing without enforcement, that systems designed to oppress will always find ways to maintain that oppression through fraud, through intimidating witnesses, through dismissing evidence, through accepting lies and rejecting truth, until people demand something different. Her case showed that freedom isn't just a legal status, it's something that must be protected actively, defended constantly, fought for relentlessly. Sarah was born free, but that birth status couldn't protect her from kidnapping. Her parents had documented her freedom meticulously, but those documents couldn't overcome a judge's commitment to protecting slavery. She'd lived in freedom for 12 years, but those years couldn't prevent 17 more years of bondage. Freedom required more than papers. It required a legal system committed to truth. It required law enforcement willing to protect the vulnerable. It required judges who would prioritize justice over property. It required a society that valued black lives and black liberty enough to defend them. Sarah lived into her later years as a free woman in a nominally free society. She never fully recovered from what had been taken from her. The trauma of kidnapping, of 17 years in bondage, of watching a courtroom dismiss evidence of her freedom. That trauma stayed with her always. She had nightmares. Moments of panic when she heard certain sounds or saw certain sights that reminded her of the plantation. Trust issues that made relationships difficult. A persistent vigilance, a constant awareness that security was fragile, that freedom could be stolen again. But she also had moments of joy. A marriage built on mutual understanding. The simple pleasure of choosing where to live, where to work, how to spend her time. The profound satisfaction of telling her story and knowing it would be preserved, that it would matter, that it would contribute to a broader understanding of American history. In her final years, Sarah was interviewed by a researcher documenting the stories of people who'd been kidnapped and enslaved despite free birth. She was elderly then, her memory sometimes faltering on details but crystal clear on the essential facts. The interviewer asked her what she wanted people to remember about her story. Sarah thought for a long moment before responding. "I want them to remember that I was born free," she said. "That I knew freedom, that I never forgot who I was, even when everyone else insisted I was someone else. I want them to remember that my parents never stopped fighting, that they did everything right, followed every law, presented every proof, and it still wasn't enough. I want them to remember that the system failed me deliberately. Not by accident, not through oversight. Deliberately. Because that's what it was designed to do." She paused, then continued. "And I want them to remember that I survived, that despite everything taken from me, despite 17 years stolen, despite all the lies and the cruelty and the injustice, I survived. I'm still Sarah. I'm still free. They couldn't take that from me, no matter how hard they tried." Sarah died in 1889, 41 years after finally returning home from bondage. She was 77 years old. Her obituary, published in the local newspaper, noted her remarkable life. Born free. Kidnapped at 12, enslaved for 17 years. Freed by the Civil War. Reunited with her father. A survivor, a witness to history. Her story remains with us today. It's taught in schools and universities. It's cited in legal scholarship. It's preserved in historical archives. It's part of the American story. The ugly parts we'd rather forget but must remember. Because Sarah's story asks us uncomfortable questions. Questions about the gap between what our laws promise and what our systems deliver. Questions about how easily freedom can be stolen when society chooses to look away. Questions about what justice really means when the system designed to provide it is fundamentally corrupt. Her story reminds us that freedom on paper is meaningless without the commitment to protect it in practice. That documents and evidence and truth itself can be dismissed when power decides to ignore them. That systems don't become just by accident. They become just through constant vigilance, constant pressure, constant insistence that they serve justice rather than oppression. Sarah was born free. She was stolen. She was sold. She was taken to court with proof of her freedom and declared property anyway. She spent 17 years knowing the truth while the system insisted on lies. And she survived to tell her story, to make sure we couldn't forget, to force us to confront what was done to her and to thousands like her. This is her story. This is our history. This is the truth we cannot afford to forget. Because the question Sarah's life asks us is still relevant today. What does freedom really mean when the system designed to protect it chooses to look away? Her answer was clear. Freedom means nothing without justice. And justice requires that we never stop fighting, never stop documenting, never stop insisting that the system serve all people equally. Sarah was born free. The system stole that freedom. She reclaimed it. And her story remains a testament, a warning, and a call to ensure that what happened to her can never happen again.